Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into something fascinating, the friendship and the theological relationship between JRR Tolkien and C.S. Lewis,
Hmm.
specifically after Lewis converted to Christianity. We've got some great material here looking at how they first connected, their time with the Inklings,
Right, that famous group.
what they agreed on theologically, where they, well, differed, how faith showed up in their writing.
Which was quite different sometimes.
Definitely. And also, how their friendship changed over time, the later years.
It's a rich story.
It is. And for everyone listening, if you want to get a good handle on this quickly, maybe have a few aha moments,
Yeah.
this is kind of your shortcut.
Yeah, way to get the core insights.
Our mission, basically, is to pull out the key stuff about this dynamic, their agreements, their disagreements, how it all shaped their work, their lives.
It's amazing, really, how a shared love for stories kick it all off, especially considering where their faith journeys ended up.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The sources say they first clicked back in the mid-1920s at Oxford. It was this shared love, wasn't it? Mythology, language.
Absolutely. Kindred spirits. You mentioned Lewis's famous line, "What, you two?" That says it all, really.
That moment of finding someone who just gets your passion, it's special.
It really is. And that common ground was, well, fertile soil for everything that followed, especially Lewis's path to faith.
Exactly. And a huge turning point was that conversation, the one on Addison's Walk, September 1931.
The late night talk. Very famous.
At that time, Lewis loved myths, but he saw them as, well, beautiful lies, basically.
Lies breathed through silver, I think he called them. He felt their power but didn't think they were true.
Right. Artistically moving, emotionally powerful, but not real.
And that's where Tolkien steps in.
Yeah, Tolkien, the devout Catholic, he had a completely different take.
He argued they weren't just lies, they held fragments of truth.
Splinters of truth. Because
Yeah.
our imagination itself comes from God.
Precisely. He said something like, "We come from God, so the myths we weave, even with errors, reflect a splintered bit of the true light."
Wow. So our stories echo something divine.
That's the core idea,
Mhm.
that human creativity isn't just random. It taps into something deeper.
And on that walk, with Hugo Dyson there too, Tolkien argued that the Christ story was unique.
The myth that actually happened.
Yeah, the fulfillment of all those old dying and rising God stories you see everywhere.
He was basically saying Christianity wasn't just another myth. It was the one that made sense of all the others, the true one.
Lewis summed it up brilliantly in the letter, didn't he? He called the gospel a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with the tremendous difference that it really happened.
That phrase, "it really happened," that seems to be what broke through Lewis's intellectual barriers.
It seems so. The idea of a true myth.
And it happened fast. Within days, he moved from just believing in God to believing in Christ.
He actually wrote about it, crediting that specific talk with Tolkien and Dyson.
Yeah. So that shared insight, that understanding of myth and truth, became, well, the absolute bedrock of their friendship, especially early on.
And that friendship really found a home, didn't it, with the Inklings? Can you give us a picture of that group?
Sure. The Inklings, it was this informal literary circle, really built around Tolkien and Lewis at Oxford. Others joined over time, like Owen Barfield, Charles Williams, Lewis's brother Warnie.
A real gathering of minds.
Definitely. They had regular meetups, Tuesdays, famously, at the Eagle and Child Pub.
The bird and baby, right?
That's the one, a proper pub setting. And then Thursday evenings in Lewis's college rooms.
Sounds like the ideal mix: serious talk, good company,
Right.
pints, pipe smoke, manuscripts being read out loud.
Absolutely. Lewis wrote about their Monday meetings covering everything from university politics, poetry critiques, theology, and even body puns.
So not always deadly serious then.
Not at all. That mix of high-minded debate and, well, just enjoying each other's company and wit, that was key.
Yeah, the sources give these great little snapshots. Warnie Lewis's diary mentions a debate about cannibalism.
Oh, yes. Apparently, Tolkien was the only one arguing, quite fiercely, that it was never justifiable under any circumstances.
Really shows his strong moral compass, maybe even a bit uncompromising sometimes.
It does suggest how their fundamental beliefs, their moral frameworks, informed even those kinds of, well, more unusual discussions. It wasn't just abstract talk.
And crucially, the Inklings was like a workshop for their writing.
A vital one. They'd read their works in progress aloud, early drafts, often.
And get honest feedback. Probably very honest feedback.
Brutally honest. Sometimes, I imagine. but supportive. That kind of environment, it's gold for a writer.
And Lewis was huge for Tolkien, especially to The Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely essential. For years, Lewis was pretty much Tolkien's only audience. He loved it, called it good beyond hope.
He even tried to get him the Nobel Prize.
He did. That level of belief from a friend, especially one whose opinion you respect, must have been incredibly important for Tolkien, who worked on Middle-earth for so long.
And it went both ways, right? Tolkien gave Lewis feedback, too.
Oh, for sure. On Lewis's early stuff, the sci-fi, the theology, the Narnia beginnings, Tolkien was a sharp critic.
So real mutual support, they were invested in each other's work.
Deeply invested. More than just friends, they were intellectual and creative partners in a way.
And Lewis's love for hearing things read aloud apparently really pushed Tolkien to finish Lord of the Rings.
Yes, Tolkien himself said that without Lewis, his only audience for so long, Middle-earth might have just stayed in his study. Never finished.
It's incredible to think how different things might be without that friendship, without the Inklings.
The whole landscape of fantasy literature, really.
Okay, so Lewis converts to Anglicanism, we should note, and they find a lot of common ground spiritually.
A huge amount. They were both fundamentally Christian intellectuals. They held to core doctrines, believed in a moral order beyond just human opinion.
Right, that transcendental moral order. They didn't like the growing materialism.
No, or the kind of modern relativism that says truth is just subjective. They stood for objective values.
And you see that in their books, don't you? The clear good versus evil.
Very much so. Lewis's idea of the Tao and the abolition of man, this universal moral law, it really aligns with Tolkien's Catholic idea of natural law.
That belief in objective truth and virtue is powerful in both their worlds.
It's a shared bedrock, and it fueled so many conversations.
And they both saw imagination and myth as ways to get at truth. That Addison's walk insight stuck.
Deeply. Lewis wrote his essay, Myth Became Fact, echoing Tolkien's idea that the Christian story works like myth, but is true history.
And Tolkien had his theory of subcreation.
Right, creating fantasy worlds as a way of reflecting God the Creator. Almost a form of worship, he thought, making secondary worlds.
It elevates storytelling, doesn't it? More than just entertainment.
Exactly. They both felt imaginative stories could wake people up to moral and spiritual realities, maybe in ways sermons couldn't.
Tolkien said myths could carry hints of the highest matters.
And Lewis talked about smuggling theology past people's defenses.
It's that power of narrative, isn't it? Stories get under your skin.
They bypass the intellectual arguments sometimes and hit you on a deeper level.
They also agreed on core things, like salvation through Christ.
Fundamentally, yes. And neither liked narrow-minded dogmatism much.
Lewis's mere Christianity idea focusing on the common ground.
Tolkien largely agreed with the idea of focusing on basics, even if he felt Catholicism held the full truth. He respected Lewis's approach.
And they both believed in sanctification, like faith changing your character over time.
Yes, that growth towards holiness. You see it in their characters' journeys.
Interestingly, Lewis had some views that lean quite Catholic, didn't he?
He did, which must have pleased Tolkien. Lewis believed in a kind of purgatory. He prayed for the dead, went to confession in the Anglican Church, had a very high view of the Eucharist.
Seeing it as more than just symbolic.
Right. Tolkien even said Lewis had much of the maker's mind about sacraments, a real appreciation for that mystery.
But despite all that common ground, there were still big differences.
Oh, definitely. There are different church backgrounds. Tolkien's Catholicism, Lewis's Anglicanism that inevitably led to disagreements. Frequent ones, it seems.
This is where it gets really interesting, the nuances.
It wasn't all smooth sailing. They had real points of tension.
A big one was church authority, right?
Yeah, that's central. Tolkien accepted the Pope, the magisterium, the church's teaching authority. Lewis was much more suspicious of that kind of centralized power.
And Lewis said himself that papal authority and maybe Marian doctrines were why he didn't become Catholic.
He felt he found grace where he was in Anglicanism and felt he should stay unless absolutely convinced otherwise. Loyalty played a part.
Tolkien understood that maybe, but he also thought Lewis had a kind of bias.
He jokingly called it Lewis's ulterior motive.
Because of his Protestant upbringing in Northern Ireland.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tolkien felt there was this subconscious anti-Catholic prejudice ingrained from childhood.
Yeah.
Lewis even admitted being taught never to trust a papist.
Wow. That historical baggage is real.
It shaped things.
Yeah.
Sometimes it surfaced, like with Lewis's book on 16th century literature.
Right, he used the term papists. and praised Calvin.
Yeah, Tolkien found that really grating. He saw it as Protestant bias, and it genuinely hurt him coming from a friend.
Shows how personal these things could be, even academic terms.
Absolutely. What's neutral history to one person can be deeply loaded for another.
And sacraments and rituals were another difference.
A key one. Tolkien's faith was profoundly sacramental. Daily Mass, deep devotion to the Eucharist, the belief in transubstantiation.
The actual transformation of bread and wine.
Yes, Lewis valued communion and confession in his own tradition, but his understanding wasn't the same. He was cautious about maybe perceived excesses or doctrines he didn't see directly in Scripture.
So he wouldn't accept all 7 Catholic sacraments or transubstantiation itself.
Formally, no. It reflects that basic Catholic-Protestant divide on sacramental theology.
And Mary. Devotion to the Virgin Mary.
Another major point. Tolkien had immense reverence for Mary. He even credited her influence for the good things in his writing.
That's quite something.
It is. Lewis respected Mary's role, of course, but he was uncomfortable with what he saw as Catholics putting her too high, almost alongside Christ.
He didn't pray to Mary or believe in things like the Immaculate Conception or Assumption.
No, he mentioned in letters that Marian doctrines and the Pope were his biggest hurdles with Catholicism.
You can imagine those conversations being delicate. Tolkien's deep devotion versus Lewis's more reserved stance.
Very delicate, I suspect.
And finally, marriage and divorce.
They differed there too. Lewis, in Christian behavior, suggested that while Christian marriage should be lifelong, maybe secular governments could allow civil divorce.
Okay, a kind of pragmatic view for society.
Perhaps. But Tolkien strongly disagreed. He saw marriage as one sacred union, based on Jesus' words, and worried Lewis's view was too lax, potentially undermining Christian morals. He disliked the idea of separate civil and church ceremonies too.
So Tolkien was more absolute, rooted in Catholic teaching.
So summing up, Tolkien, more traditional, churchly, emphasizing authority absolutes. Lewis, more broad, non-denominational, mere Christianity.
And that created tension, especially on the Catholic Protestant stuff.
Right. Tolkien maybe felt Lewis's faith missed some fullness. Lewis perhaps saw Tolkien's as having unnecessary additions.
But it didn't break the friendship.
No major rupture.
Yeah.
But it definitely contributed to a gentle cooling over time compared to the early intensity.
It's amazing they navigated those differences for so long.
It speaks volumes about the respect they had for each other, despite disagreeing on things that were clearly very important to both of them.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. How did all this theology play out in their actual writing, their fiction?
Ah, now that's fascinating. You see similarities, but also really sharp differences, especially about allegory.
Tolkien famously disliked allegory, right?
Hated it, pretty
Yeah.
much. He felt it forced the author's meaning onto the reader too much. Said so in the foreword to Lord of the Rings.
He wanted the story to work on multiple levels, not just be a code for something else.
Exactly. He thought myth's power was in its resonance, its ambiguity almost, not a one-to-one mapping of ideas.
Whereas Lewis was more okay with it.
Much more. His early book, The Pilgrim's Regress, is pure allegory, and he used strong symbolism throughout his fiction.
He saw it as a useful tool.
It seems so. A way to make theological ideas concrete, accessible, especially for, say, children.
Which brings us to Narnia.
Yes. And Tolkien's reaction to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
He wasn't a fan.
Not really. He thought the Christian parallels in Aslan's death and resurrection mirroring Christ were just too obvious, too blatant.
Like Lewis was hitting you over the head with it.
That was Tolkien's feeling, yeah. Too explicit. He preferred religious elements to be woven in, subtly, deeply buried.
Enhancing the story, not dominating it.
Right. Lewis defended Narnia, saying it wasn't strict allegory, but a supposal. What if God became a lion in another world?
But even so, the effect is pretty allegorical for the reader.
Undeniably. You can see why Tolkien, with his very different approach to world building, would balk at it.
Tolkien also had issues with Lewis mixing mythologies in Narnia.
He did. Talking animals, Father Christmas, Greek fauns. Tolkien, the meticulous creator of Middle-earth's consistent history and feel, found it jarring. Inconsistent.
He's messy, man.
Kind of messy, yeah. He felt Middle-earth had more imaginative integrity. He apparently said Narnia simply wouldn't do for him, just wasn't his cup of tea.
That points to Tolkien's deep commitment to internal consistency, that verisimilitude in his secondary world.
Absolutely. A commitment Lewis didn't share to quite the same degree. Lewis was maybe more fluid, less systematic in his fantasy elements.
And Tolkien found Lewis's style too didactic sometimes, too preachy, and maybe rushed.
Yes. Lewis wrote incredibly fast. Whole books in months. Tolkien labored for years on details. That difference in process surely affected how they saw each other's work.
That contrast, Lewis the fast producer, Tolkien the slow perfectionist, is really key.
It is. Lewis, for his part, defended Narnia. Argued the lion figure was an imaginative way to reach kids to, smuggle theology in.
While Tolkien preferred his mere hints of higher things.
Exactly. He later said Lord of the Rings is fundamentally Catholic, but deliberately avoids direct religious stuff, focusing on embodying virtues instead.
You see the difference clearly. Lewis has Aslan, the emperor over the sea, even Emeth getting saved in the last battle. Very direct parallels.
Much more overt. You can almost picture Tolkien teasing Lewis about Father Christmas, and Lewis defending it good-naturedly.
That friendly sparring, even when they disagreed artistically.
It speaks to their underlying affection.
They also differed in setting, didn't they? Tolkien's completely invented secondary world.
Right, with its own languages, history. Christian elements are metaphorical, like Gandalf's return.
Whereas Lewis sets stories in our world or worlds with more direct biblical links.
Yeah, the space trilogy, the Great Divorce, Narnia's creation, and end-time scenes. Tolkien didn't like people trying to translate Middle-earth into simple allegory.
He wanted it to stand on its own.
As a mythos.
It's interesting that Lewis loved and championed Lord of the Rings so much.
He absolutely did. Wrote glowing reviews.
But Tolkien never really seemed to enjoy Narnia. He was silent at first, later called it too Christian mixed mythology.
That imbalance in appreciation probably did strain things a little, subtly. Lewis might have felt the lack of Tolkien's full approval. Tolkien may be uneasy about Lewis's popular success with it.
So their big literary debate was about how explicit faith should be in fiction.
That seems to be the core of it. And they basically agreed to disagree. Lewis, the evangelist storyteller, Tolkien, the mythmaker.
And both approaches have been hugely influential.
Absolutely. Both have led countless readers towards faith, or at least a sense of something deeper. Lewis's smuggling idea worked, and so did Tolkien's hints. Stories slipping past the watchful dragons of the mind, as Lewis put it.
A testament to the different ways faith can fuel creativity.
Definitely.
Okay, so moving into the 1940s, 1950s, the sources suggest their friendship, while still there, kind of cooled off a bit.
Yeah, cooled is probably the right word. Not a big blow-up, but a gradual distancing. Various things contributed.
Like Lewis becoming really famous.
That seems to have been a factor. During the war, Lewis became this huge public voice for Christianity. The BBC talks, Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, incredibly popular.
While Tolkien was still plugging away quietly on Middle-earth.
Right, and Tolkien, preferring his more scholarly, mythic way of exploring faith, had mixed feelings about Lewis the popular apologist.
He thought popular theology simplified things too much.
He seemed wary of it. His private comments about not being entirely enthusiastic, warning about lay people doing theology publicly, it suggests a certain academic caution, maybe discomfort.
Could there have been a touch of jealousy, even? Lewis getting all this acclaim.
It's possible. Hard to say for sure, but the dynamic definitely shifted. Lewis was the famous author, Tolkien wasn't yet, not on that scale. Tolkien championed Lewis's early academic work, but seemed less thrilled by the popular success.
That shift in public profile can strain things.
It could introduce an imbalance, yeah.
Another factor was Charles Williams joining the circle.
Yes. Lewis became very close to Williams, shared his interest in mysticism, maybe even occult-ish ideas.
And Tolkien wasn't so keen on Williams.
He never clicked with him in the same way. Tolkien wrote later that Williams's arrival was the first thing that really separated him and Lewis. He felt a bit sidelined, maybe disapproved of some of Williams' ideas too.
Adding a third person to a closed duo often changes things.
It can definitely shift the dynamic. Tolkien seems to have felt displaced.
But the biggest personal thing was Lewis's marriage to Joy Davidman.
That seems to have hit Tolkien hardest. Lewis marrying, especially later in life, was a surprise. But crucially, he didn't tell Tolkien about the civil ceremony beforehand.
Tolkien found out from others.
Yes, and he was deeply hurt. Felt it was a lack of trust. He wrote to his son, "We were separated by his marriage, of which he never even told me."
That sounds really painful, a real break in intimacy.
It does. And remember, Tolkien, as a Catholic, likely had issues with Joy being divorced and remarrying. Plus, marriage naturally meant Lewis had less time for the Inklings.
Which were already fading a bit. And Lewis moved to Cambridge.
Right. The meetings became less frequent. Lewis took the Cambridge professorship in the mid-50s. All these life changes inevitably created distance, both practically and emotionally.
And maybe Lewis occasionally said things about Catholicism in his writing that annoyed Tolkien.
Probably. Even unintentional remarks can sting when they touch on something so deeply held. And Lewis, for his part, might have found Tolkien a bit stubborn sometimes.
So by the later years, they probably just avoided the tricky theological topics.
It seems likely. They probably stuck to safer ground to avoid contention.
A poignant shift from those intense early debates.
It is. But it shows how even strong friendships evolve and face challenges.
Yet, despite that cooling, they still cared for each other.
Oh, absolutely. The underlying respect and affection remained. When Lewis got seriously ill in the early 60s, Tolkien visited him.
And they could still connect, recapture some of the old feeling.
Sources suggest they could. Moments where the old ease returned, reminiscing about the early days, the walks and talks.
Those final visits must have been important.
A reminder of the deep foundation beneath the later complexities.
Lewis died in November '63.
Yes. And Tolkien, who lived another 10 years, wrote very movingly about the loss. Like losing a branch from a tree, he said.
He acknowledged Lewis's huge role, calling him his only audience for so long, crucial for Lord of the Rings getting published.
That gratitude really came through after Lewis's death. The earlier frictions seemed less important in the face of loss.
There's that story, isn't there, about Tolkien bringing his son, the priest, to see Lewis near the end?
Yes, perhaps hoping for a final blessing, maybe even a conversion. It's a touching story, whether entirely accurate or not.
It shows Tolkien's deep, ongoing concern for Lewis's soul right up to the end.
Absolutely. That gesture, whatever the exact intent, speaks volumes about the enduring love, even with their differences.
So, in the end, they kind of came full circle.
It seems so. United by a love of God, even if they differed on the church, a profound love of story, and that deep personal affection forged over decades.
It's quite a legacy, just thinking about the sheer range of their talks after 1931.
It's staggering. Myth, revelations, sacraments, morality, the modern world, they covered so much ground.
And their shared core beliefs gave them that common language.
A foundation, yes, which actually allowed for those passionate, sometimes sharp disagreements to happen without completely destroying the relationship.
Disagreement wasn't disaffection for them.
Often it spurred them on, sharpened their own thinking.
And those differences definitely shaped the friendship, sometimes drawing them closer in debate, sometimes creating that distance.
Right. And if you try to picture them talking, you have to remember all the facets. They weren't just theologians. They were professors, poets, and sometimes like schoolboys enjoying jokes and wordplay.
Humphrey Carpenter said the Inklings were defined by argument, disagreement, difference, held together by affection. That sounds about right for them.
Perfectly put. Any realistic imagined chat between them needs that mix, that friction alongside the friendship.
You could imagine them debating myth again, Lewis maybe quoting Tolkien back at him.
Definitely. Or Tolkien gently pressing Lewis on Catholicism, and Lewis responding with reason, maybe a touch of impatience, saying something like, prayer heals schism better than controversy.
Discussing prayer, church life. Tolkien on the Mass, Lewis on common prayer.
And definitely sparring over Narnia versus Middle-earth again. Gentle digs about symbolism.
Debating mere Christianity, Lewis defending it, Tolkien maybe raising concerns about what's left out.
And always coming back to stories, literature. Tolkien reading from the Silmarillion, Lewis connecting it to Genesis, comparing their characters' moral choices.
The whole spectrum, Lewis said about the Inklings. When it had succeeded, there was no one. I would have rather spent an evening.
And that success came from that blend of agreement and disagreement they embodied. Friendship and debate, faith and reason, jest and earnestness.
Their actual conversations left such a mark on their lives, their books that still feel like they're in conversation today.
It's a powerful example, isn't it? That you can disagree deeply with someone you love deeply, and maybe even push each other further up and further in, as Lewis might say.
Towards truth, towards imagination, both.
Which leads to a really interesting thought for everyone listening. How does that tension between agreement and disagreement play out in our own lives, in our understanding, our relationships? Think about Tolkien and Lewis. How might exploring those nuances enrich our own journeys, intellectually and spiritually?